The precise date remains unrecorded in official documents, but multiple sources place the incident in the autumn of 1957, shortly after the Appalachian meeting that would expose the National Crime Syndicate to unprecedented scrutiny. The location was established, a brownstone in Lower Manhattan that served as one of Vito Genovese's secondary residences, a place where he conducted business he preferred to keep separate from his primary home in New Jersey. The building stood on a quiet street where neighbors had learned not to notice the black Cadillacs that occasionally appeared at unusual hours. Inside, the decor reflected Genovese's aspirations toward respectability. Heavy furniture and dark wood, oil paintings of Italian countryside scenes, thick carpets that muffled footsteps. The air carried the scent of expensive cigars and the faint trace of marinara sauce from a late dinner. This was a space designed to project authority, to make visitors understand they had entered the domain of a man who controlled significant portions of the city's criminal economy. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known throughout Harlem as Bumpy, had built his reputation over 3 decades of careful navigation through the city's underworld. Born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, he had arrived in Harlem during the Great Migration and survived through a combination of street intelligence and strategic alliance building that set him apart from those who relied solely on violence or intimidation. By 1957, he controlled substantial portions of Harlem's numbers racket, maintained relationships with political figures in Tammany Hall's remnants, and had demonstrated an unusual capacity for operating across racial boundaries that typically divided New York's criminal enterprises. His physical presence commanded attention, a stocky build carried with contained energy, dark suits tailored to suggest success without ostentation, and a facial expression that revealed nothing. Those who knew him understood that beneath the careful exterior operated a mind constantly assessing angles, calculating probabilities, and identifying the structural weaknesses in any situation. The relationship between Bumpy Johnson and the Italian crime families had always required careful management. The Italian syndicates controlled the larger criminal infrastructure, labor unions, waterfront operations, political connections that reached into City Hall and the police department. Black operators in Harlem had traditionally functioned as middle management, collecting street-level proceeds that ultimately flowed to Italian bosses who provided protection and access to political cover. This arrangement had persisted through decades of informal negotiation and occasional violence, maintaining a profitable equilibrium that neither side had strong incentive to disrupt. Bumpy had operated within this system since the 1930s, initially under the protection of Dutch Schultz, and later establishing direct relationships with Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello. His value lay partly in his ability to maintain order in Harlem without requiring constant Italian intervention, and partly in his willingness to share proceeds according to understood percentages. Vito Genovese represented a different approach to power. Born in Naples and arriving in New York as a teenager, he had climbed through the ranks of what would become known as the Genovese crime family through ruthless elimination of competitors and a willingness to employ violence that shocked even his fellow mobsters. He had fled to Italy in 1937 to avoid murder charges, spent World War II in fascist Italy, where he allegedly maintained relationships with Mussolini's regime, and returned to New York in 1945 with ambitions to control the entire Italian criminal apparatus in the city. By 1957, he had orchestrated the assassination of Albert Anastasia and was positioning himself as the dominant figure among the 5 families. His worldview contained little room for partnership with black operators in Harlem. He saw their earnings as tribute owed to Italian authority and their independence as a structural problem requiring correction. The trap, when it came, revealed careful planning. Bumpy received word through an intermediary that Genovese wanted a meeting to discuss territories and payment arrangements. The message came through channels that seemed legitimate. A capo, who had worked with Bumpy for years, delivered the invitation personally, presenting it as routine business negotiation. The location was specified as a social club in Little Italy, neutral ground where similar meetings had occurred without incident. The time was set for late evening when streets would be relatively empty. Everything about the arrangement followed established protocols for such discussions. Bumpy recognized these details because he had participated in dozens of similar meetings over the years. The very ordinariness of the invitation constituted its danger. Intelligence came from multiple sources in the days before the scheduled meeting. A numbers runner who collected in a neighborhood where several Genovese soldiers lived mentioned unusual activity. Extra men arriving, conversations conducted in hushed tones that stopped when outsiders approached. A police detective on Bumpy's payroll reported that several patrol cars had been reassigned away from Little Italy for that evening, suggesting someone had arranged for reduced official presence. A bartender at the social club mentioned that furniture had been moved in the back room, creating open space where normally tables and chairs stood close together. Each piece of information alone might mean nothing. Assembled together, they suggested preparation for violence. Bumpy canceled the meeting through the same intermediary who had delivered the invitation, citing illness. This excuse satisfied no one, but it bought time. The response came within 24 hours. A different message, this one carrying barely concealed threat. Genovese expected Bumpy to present himself within the week to discuss new financial arrangements for Harlem operations. The percentages mentioned represented a dramatic increase in tribute, amounts that would effectively reduce Bumpy to employee status while eliminating his ability to maintain the political relationships and street-level organization that gave him independent power. The message included a reminder that other black operators in the city had accepted similar arrangements. The implication was clear. Bumpy could accept subordination voluntarily or have it imposed through violence that would eliminate him and install someone more compliant. The public nature of this pressure mattered as much as the substance. Word spread through Harlem that Bumpy faced demands he might lack the power to resist. Some of his own operators began making contingency plans, establishing relationships with Italian contacts in case leadership changed. Politicians who had accepted Bumpy's money for years started taking calls from Genovese's representatives, indicating their willingness to work with new management. The police officers and judges who had provided protection began to distance themselves. Understanding that backing the losing side in a power struggle could end careers or lives. This erosion of support constituted its own form of attack, potentially more devastating than direct violence because it dismantled the network of relationships that made Bumpy's position viable. What distinguished Bumpy's response was the absence of visible reaction. He did not call meetings to rally supporters or make speeches about respect and territory. He did not threaten retaliation or attempt to match Genovese's displays of force. Instead, he withdrew into apparent acceptance. He reduced his public presence, spending less time at the social clubs and restaurants where he typically conducted business. Associates who expected confrontation found him oddly philosophical, acknowledging Genovese's power and suggesting that perhaps arrangements would need adjustment. This performance of submission was calculated theater, designed to create the impression that Bumpy recognized the futility of resistance. Those watching from outside saw a man accepting inevitable defeat. Those who knew him better recognized the pattern. Bumpy always retreated before he advanced, always appeared to concede before he struck. The period of withdrawal lasted nearly 2 weeks. During this time, Bumpy conducted a different kind of business, building a coalition that would prove far more effective than any show of force. The first conversations occurred with lawyers who specialized in federal criminal defense, men who maintained relationships with prosecutors in the Southern District of New York. These attorneys understood that the Appalachian meeting in November 1957 had created unprecedented opportunity for federal intervention in organized crime. The gathering of over 50 Italian crime bosses at a rural estate in upstate New York had shocked federal authorities and provided legal justification for investigations that previously faced political obstacles. Bumpy's lawyers explained that federal prosecutors were actively seeking witnesses and evidence that could support conspiracy charges under laws that had never successfully been applied to organized crime leadership. The attorneys made clear they could facilitate connections between Bumpy and these federal investigators, but only if Bumpy possessed information valuable enough to justify the risk prosecutors would take in working with a criminal figure. Bumpy possessed such information in abundance. 3 decades of operating within the Italian criminal structure had given him detailed knowledge of financial arrangements, political payoffs, labor union infiltration, and murder contracts. He knew which police captains received regular payments, which judges decided cases based on money rather than law, which politicians served as fronts for criminal interests. He understood the mechanics of the heroin distribution system that was beginning to flood into Harlem neighborhoods, including the Italian wholesalers who controlled importation and the corrupt customs officials who facilitated entry. This information had protected him in the past. Everyone understood that moving against Bumpy risked exposure of systems that generated millions of dollars for dozens of powerful figures. Now that protection could become a weapon. The second element of Bumpy's coalition involved political figures in Harlem who recognized that their own positions depended on maintaining black economic power in the neighborhood. These were not criminals, but legitimate community leaders, ministers, civil rights organizers, Democratic Party officials who controlled patronage jobs and municipal contracts. They understood that if Italian crime families eliminated independent black operators, control of Harlem's substantial illegal economy would flow downtown, removing resources that currently funded community organizations, churches, and political campaigns. These leaders could not openly support criminal activity, but they could apply pressure through legitimate channels. Ministers could deliver sermons about outside exploitation and organize boycotts of Italian-owned businesses in Harlem. Political figures could investigate police corruption and demand that law enforcement address organized crime rather than just street-level offenses. Civil rights organizations could publicize the racial dimensions of Italian attempts to subordinate black economic activity, framing the conflict in terms that would attract media attention and federal scrutiny. The third component involved other black operators who faced the same subordination Genovese demanded from Bumpy. These men controlled numbers, operations, loan sharking networks, and protection rackets in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens. They had watched Bumpy's situation with understandable concern, recognizing that if Genovese succeeded in Harlem, similar demands would follow elsewhere. Bumpy reached out through intermediaries, proposing coordination rather than competition. If all black operators simultaneously reduced payments to Italian bosses while increasing their own security and political protection, the Italians would face a choice: accept reduced revenue and increased risk, or negotiate terms that preserved profitable relationships. This strategy required unity among figures who often competed with each other, but fear of common subordination provided powerful motivation. The fourth element proved most surprising to those who learned of it later. Bumpy established communication with Frank Costello, the Italian boss who had previously dominated organized crime in New York before being shot and partially displaced by Genovese's rise to power. Costello had survived the assassination attempt, but recognized that Genovese's increasing authority threatened not just his own position, but the relatively stable arrangements that had made all the families profitable. Costello represented an older generation that preferred negotiation to violence, that maintained relationships with legitimate business and political leaders, that understood excessive warfare attracted attention the organization could not afford. He recognized that Genovese's aggressive expansion and elimination of established operators would eventually provoke federal response that could destroy the entire system. Costello could not openly oppose Genovese without triggering civil war within the Italian families, but he could provide information, warn of planned actions, and ensure that certain resources remained available to those resisting Genovese's control. The strategy that emerged from these various relationships operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the federal level, information began flowing to prosecutors investigating organized crime. The details came not directly from Bumpy, but through the lawyers who maintained legitimate attorney-client relationships with multiple parties. These attorneys could honestly tell investigators they had learned information from clients seeking legal advice, without identifying which clients or explicitly encouraging cooperation. The information was specific and verifiable: dates of meetings, amounts of payments, names of political figures who accepted bribes. Federal investigators could follow these leads to build cases that did not require Bumpy's direct testimony, but would create legal pressure on the Italian families. At the political level, community leaders began asking pointed questions about police protection of Italian criminal operations in Harlem while aggressively enforcing laws against black operators. Ministers organized meetings where residents testified about police corruption and selective enforcement. Democratic Party officials in Harlem, many of whom depended on black voter support, demanded investigations and hearings. Newspapers received anonymous tips about relationships between Italian crime figures and city officials. The Amsterdam News and other black newspapers published editorials about economic exploitation and racial subordination in criminal markets. This campaign created political costs for officials who had previously ignored organized crime in exchange for payments or political support. At the street level, coordination among black operators produced tangible effects. Payments to Italian bosses declined significantly as multiple operators simultaneously renegotiated terms or simply reduced what they forwarded uptown. This resistance spread across neighborhoods, making it impossible for Genovese to respond everywhere at once. Italian enforcers who attempted to collect through intimidation found themselves facing coordinated security rather than isolated operators. Several incidents occurred where Italian collectors were politely but firmly turned away by groups of armed men who made clear that violence would be reciprocated. These confrontations stopped short of actual shooting, but established that subordination would not be accepted without resistance. Within the Italian families, tension increased as Costello and other older bosses questioned whether Genovese's aggressive tactics were worth the federal attention and street-level conflict they generated. Some capos suggested that traditional arrangements had been profitable precisely because they maintained peace and avoided scrutiny. The Appalachian meeting had already created unprecedented problems: federal investigations, newspaper attention, congressional hearings. Adding open conflict with black operators in Harlem would make the situation worse, while disrupting revenue flows that enriched everyone. These arguments gained force as federal pressure increased and street-level collections declined. Genovese faced a deteriorating situation. Federal investigators were building cases that could lead to decades in prison. Political pressure made it more difficult to maintain protection relationships with police and city officials. Street-level resistance threatened revenue that funded the entire organization. Other Italian bosses were questioning his leadership. He needed to resolve the Harlem situation quickly and decisively, demonstrating that his authority could not be challenged. The conventional response would have been overwhelming violence, eliminate Bumpy and several other black operators simultaneously, install compliant replacements, use spectacular brutality to discourage future resistance. This approach had worked for decades. What made it problematic now was the audience. Federal prosecutors were watching specifically for evidence of conspiracy and murder. Political leaders in Harlem were ready to publicize any violence as racial oppression. Other Italian bosses were looking for excuses to limit Genovese's authority. The decision to trap Bumpy apparently emerged from this calculation. A meeting could be arranged that appeared legitimate, drawing Bumpy into a location where he could be eliminated without witnesses who would talk to authorities. The death could be explained as internal conflict among black operators, something police would investigate perfunctorily without seriously pursuing suspects. This approach had succeeded many times before. What Genovese apparently failed to consider was that Bumpy's intelligence network now extended into his own organization through Costello's people and through Italian soldiers who found Genovese's aggressive style personally threatening. The warning came through Costello's channels approximately 36 hours before the planned action. The message provided specific details: the meeting location, the actual purpose, the number of men who would be present, the plan for disposal afterward. Bumpy received this information through his lawyers, who presented it as something they had learned from other clients concerned about potential violence that could draw federal attention. The lawyers advised that Bumpy avoid the meeting and consider whether authorities should be informed. This advice was carefully phrased. The lawyers never explicitly encouraged cooperation with law enforcement, but they made clear that Bumpy faced a choice between immediate physical danger and longer-term strategic options. Bumpy's response demonstrated why he had survived 3 decades in an environment that killed most men within years. Rather than simply avoiding danger or warning authorities, he chose to demonstrate that Genovese's own security was inadequate, that the resources Genovese relied upon for protection could not prevent someone with sufficient intelligence and preparation from reaching him anywhere. This demonstration required careful planning and involved substantial risk, but it would accomplish several objectives simultaneously. It would prove that Bumpy could not be easily eliminated. It would expose vulnerabilities in Genovese's security. It would create doubt among Genovese's own people about his judgment and invincibility. Most importantly, it would shift the psychological balance from Bumpy defending against Genovese's attack to Genovese having to explain why his own home offered no safety. The operation required knowing Genovese's schedule, the layout of his secondary residence, the routines of his security personnel, and the access points that were watched less carefully than others. This information came from multiple sources: servants who worked in the building and could be approached through community connections, police officers who conducted regular patrols and noticed patterns, people in Costello's organization who maintained their own surveillance of Genovese's movements. The picture that emerged showed predictable routines with exploitable gaps. Genovese typically arrived at the Manhattan residence late evening, often after dinner meetings in Little Italy. He traveled with 2 bodyguards who would enter the building with him and remain for approximately 30 minutes before leaving him alone. He maintained no overnight security inside the residence, apparently believing that external surveillance and building security provided adequate protection. The entry occurred on a Sunday evening in late autumn of 1957. Genovese returned to the brownstone around 10 o'clock after a dinner meeting, following his usual pattern. His bodyguards accompanied him inside, checked the residence according to their routine, and departed. Building security consisted of a doorman who recognized regular residents and guests, but who could not monitor all entry points simultaneously. The building had a service entrance in the rear that connected to a courtyard shared with adjacent buildings. This entrance was locked but not continuously watched, and the lock could be defeated by someone with appropriate tools and knowledge. Access to the building through this route required precise timing to avoid residents or service workers, but on a Sunday evening, traffic was minimal. Bumpy entered through the service entrance sometime between 10:30 and 11 o'clock, accompanied by two men whose identities were never definitively established, but who were described in later accounts as experienced professionals rather than street-level operators. They moved through the building's service corridors to Genovese's floor and gained entry to the apartment through the door lock, which offered less resistance than expected. Some accounts suggest that information provided through Costello's network included lock specifications or even key copies, though this detail remains unverified. The entry was accomplished silently, without alerting neighbors or triggering any response from building security. What happened next became the subject of varying accounts, but the consistent elements across multiple sources established the basic scenario. Genovese was in his living room, possibly reading or listening to the radio, when he became aware that he was not alone. Bumpy was sitting in a chair across from him, having entered and positioned himself without making noise that would alert Genovese to his presence. The two men who had accompanied Bumpy were positioned at the apartment's entry points, ensuring that no one would interrupt the conversation. No weapons were drawn, no threats were explicitly made, but the message was unmistakable. Bumpy had penetrated security that Genovese had considered adequate, reached him in a location he had considered safe, and done so without detection or difficulty. The conversation itself was never reliably recorded. Neither participant discussed it publicly, and the two other men present maintained silence. Subsequent events suggest that Bumpy made certain facts clear. He knew about the planned trap and the intended outcome. He understood that Genovese was attempting to eliminate him and subordinate Harlem operations. He was demonstrating that Genovese could not accomplish this objective without costs Genovese was unprepared to pay. The demonstration of penetrating Genovese's security proved that retaliation was possible if violence continued. The implication was that both men had families, routines, locations they considered safe. Neither would actually be safe if they entered into open warfare. The psychological impact of this encounter exceeded whatever specific words were exchanged. Genovese had built his reputation on inspiring fear through displays of power and willingness to use extreme violence. Men who defied him disappeared or turned up dead in ways that sent messages to potential future opponents. His rise to dominance among the Italian families had involved orchestrating multiple murders and intimidating anyone who considered resistance. Now, someone had demonstrated that all this power could not prevent a determined opponent from reaching him in his own home. The demonstration challenged the foundation of his authority. If people learned that Genovese could be reached despite his security, others might attempt similar actions. If his own soldiers knew that an outsider had penetrated defenses they considered solid, their confidence in his protection would erode. Bumpy departed the same way he had entered, leaving no physical evidence of the visit beyond his presence in Genovese's memory. The two other men remained unknown to Genovese, their faces and identities kept hidden. This anonymity amplified the message. Bumpy commanded resources and people that Genovese's organization had failed to identify or account for. The entire operation demonstrated a level of planning and intelligence capability that contradicted assumptions about black operators' sophistication and reach. Genovese had treated Bumpy as a street-level figure who could be muscled into submission. The visit proved that Bumpy operated at a different level, with different capabilities and different strategic thinking. The following morning, Genovese faced a decision that would define how the situation resolved. He could respond with maximum force, attempting to eliminate Bumpy and anyone associated with him regardless of consequences. This approach would restore his reputation for overwhelming response to challenges and might discourage future opposition. However, it would also trigger the very outcomes Bumpy had prepared for: federal attention, political pressure, conflict with other black operators, potential civil war within Italian families, as Costello's faction used the situation to challenge Genovese's leadership. The violence would need to be spectacular enough to overcome Bumpy's security and support network, which would guarantee federal response and newspaper coverage. Alternatively, Genovese could accept that Bumpy had established sufficient deterrence to make negotiation preferable to conflict. This choice would represent a public retreat from previous demands and might encourage others to challenge his authority. But it would preserve revenue flows, avoid federal attention, and maintain peace within the organization. The resolution emerged gradually over subsequent weeks, rather than through any single meeting or explicit agreement. The pressure on Bumpy stopped. No more messages demanding increased payments. No more attempts to isolate him from political support or muscle him out of territory. Conversations resumed through intermediaries about traditional percentage arrangements that had existed before Genovese's attempted power grab. These negotiations recognized Bumpy's independent authority in Harlem while maintaining the broader structure of Italian dominance in citywide criminal organization. The arrangement was far from equal partnership. Bumpy still paid tribute and operated within constraints the Italian families could enforce, but it preserved his organization, his income, and most critically, his life and the lives of his associates. Within the Italian families, the situation produced its own consequences. Other bosses who had questioned Genovese's aggressive tactics now had concrete evidence that his approach created problems without producing proportional benefits. The Harlem situation had generated federal attention, political pressure, and internal conflict, while ultimately resulting in arrangements similar to what had existed before the confrontation. This failure, combined with ongoing federal investigations stemming from the Appalachian meeting, weakened Genovese's position among his peers. The culmination came in 1959 when federal prosecutors charged Genovese with narcotics conspiracy based partly on information that had flowed through the network Bumpy had helped establish. Genovese was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, where he would die in 1969. His elimination from active leadership allowed other Italian bosses to return to the more stable arrangements that had prevailed under Costello and Lucky Luciano. For Bumpy Johnson, the outcome represented a specific type of victory: survival and maintained autonomy in an environment designed to eliminate or subordinate black economic power. He continued operating Harlem's numbers racket until his death in 1968, maintaining relationships with Italian families while preserving independent authority that most black operators never achieved. His approach became a model for others navigating similar situations: build intelligence networks, create political protection, establish alliances with powerful figures in multiple factions, demonstrate capability rather than just making threats, and recognize that strategic patience often accomplished more than immediate confrontation. The broader significance of the episode extends beyond the individuals involved into the structural dynamics of organized crime in mid-20th century New York. The Italian families had established dominance partly through superior organization and political connections, but also through assumptions about their monopoly on sophistication and strategic thinking. They treated black operators as street-level help who collected money but could not truly threaten Italian control. Bumpy's response challenged these assumptions by demonstrating that intelligence, preparation, and coalition building could offset disadvantages in raw power. The demonstration did not eliminate racial hierarchy in criminal markets. Italian families continued to dominate citywide organization for decades, but it established that black operators could maintain independent space if they operated with sufficient sophistication. The methods Bumpy employed reflected broader patterns in how subordinated groups navigate systems designed to exploit them. Direct confrontation against overwhelming power typically produces defeat. Acceptance of subordination guarantees continued exploitation. The alternative involves identifying the actual mechanisms that sustain power structures and applying pressure at points where the powerful are vulnerable. For Bumpy, this meant recognizing that Genovese's power depended on political protection, internal unity among Italian families, freedom from federal prosecution, and revenue flows that kept everyone invested in stability. Disrupting these foundations through federal cooperation, political pressure, alliance with Italian rivals, and coordinated resistance among black operators proved more effective than any show of force. The intelligence dimension deserves particular attention. Bumpy's ability to learn about the planned trap before it occurred, to understand Genovese's routines and security weaknesses, and to operate inside the Italian organization's decision-making processes demonstrated sophisticated intelligence gathering that contradicted prevailing assumptions. This capability rested on decades of careful relationship building across racial and organizational boundaries. The lawyers who connected Bumpy to federal prosecutors, the police officers who shared information, the servants and low-level workers who observed powerful people's routines, the Italian soldiers who found Costello's approach more congenial than Genovese's brutality. All these relationships provided information flows that proved decisive. Building and maintaining these networks required patience, discretion, and investment over years. The immediate crisis revealed their value, but their construction had been ongoing long before conflict emerged. The psychological dimensions of the confrontation proved as important as the tangible power elements. Genovese had built his authority on fear, on the belief that challenging him meant certain death. Bumpy's entry into his living room broke that perception, not through killing Genovese, but through demonstrating that Genovese could be reached. The message was sophisticated. It proved capability without committing the act that would force all-out war. It created doubt about security while offering a path to de-escalation. It shifted Genovese's calculation from "can I eliminate this opponent?" to "what will it cost me to try?" This psychological shift proved more decisive than any single act of violence could have been because it changed the strategic calculation for everyone watching the situation. The resolution also demonstrated the limitations of power based primarily on violence. Genovese could order murders and intimidate most opponents, but this capability lost effectiveness when facing someone who had prepared adequately. Violence requires reaching the target, which depends on intelligence and security. It generates responses from law enforcement and political authorities, especially when it threatens public order or attracts media attention. It can produce internal dissent within criminal organizations when members calculate that particular conflicts risk their own positions. Bumpy's strategy systematically undermined the effectiveness of violent response by creating costs that exceeded benefits. This approach did not make him invulnerable. He could still have been killed if Genovese had been willing to pay the price, but it made that price high enough to force negotiation rather than confrontation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation maintained files on both Bumpy Johnson and Vito Genovese that eventually became available through Freedom of Information Act requests decades later. These files confirm the basic framework of events: the competition for control of Harlem criminal operations in 1957, the increase in federal surveillance following the Appalachian meeting, the cooperation of multiple sources providing information about Italian organized crime, and Genovese's eventual prosecution. The files do not confirm the specific incident of Bumpy entering Genovese's residence, which would not necessarily have been reported to federal authorities or documented in official records. However, the files do show that by early 1958, federal investigators noted a reduction in conflict between Italian families and black operators in Harlem, suggesting that previous tensions had been resolved through unknown means. The legacy of this confrontation influenced how subsequent generations of black criminal operators approached relationships with larger organized crime structures. The example demonstrated that maintaining autonomy required more than street-level violence or territorial control. It required political connections, legal sophistication, intelligence networks, and the strategic patience to build coalitions across traditional boundaries. These lessons informed the approaches of figures like Frank Matthews in the 1970s, who built independent narcotics distribution networks that operated outside Italian family control by applying similar principles of organization and political protection. The transition was neither complete nor permanent. Law enforcement eventually disrupted most independent black criminal organizations, but the model Bumpy established proved that alternatives to subordination existed for those willing to invest in the necessary infrastructure. The racial dynamics deserve explicit examination. Bumpy operated in an environment where white power structures, criminal and legitimate, assumed black inferiority and incompetence. These assumptions extended from mainstream society into criminal enterprises, where Italian families believed black operators lacked the sophistication for true independence. Bumpy's success depended partly on his ability to exceed expectations while maintaining enough humility to avoid threatening egos unnecessarily. He demonstrated competence in areas: legal strategy, political organization, intelligence gathering that contradicted prevailing stereotypes. He built relationships with powerful white figures by proving useful and reliable over decades. He recognized that changing individual minds mattered less than demonstrating capabilities that forced structural adjustment. This approach reflected broader patterns in how black professionals, business owners, and political figures navigated white-dominated spaces throughout the 20th century. The incident also illuminates the complex relationship between criminal enterprise and legitimate political and economic structures. Bumpy's victory depended substantially on connections with legal professionals, political figures, and community organizations operating in legitimate spaces. These connections existed because criminal money funded legitimate activities, political campaigns, churches, community organizations that served important functions beyond the criminal sphere. The symbiotic relationship meant that attacking Bumpy threatened resources that legitimate leaders depended upon, creating incentive for them to provide protection, even though they could not openly support criminal activity. This dynamic illustrates why organized crime persisted despite law enforcement efforts. It was integrated into economic and political systems in ways that made complete elimination extremely difficult without disrupting much larger structures. The role of federal law enforcement in this situation reflects changing approaches to organized crime during the late 1950s. Prior to this period, prosecution of organized crime typically focused on street-level offenses, individual gambling operations, single murders, specific frauds. The Italian families avoided serious consequences by maintaining political protection at local levels and by ensuring that their leadership remained insulated from direct evidence of criminal activity. The Appalachian meeting broke this pattern by exposing the national scope of coordination among Italian families. Federal prosecutors recognized opportunity to build conspiracy cases that could reach organizational leadership. They needed evidence and witnesses willing to provide information about internal operations. Bumpy's situation offered such opportunity, though the precise nature of his cooperation remained ambiguous. The information that flowed to prosecutors through his attorney network proved useful in building cases, but it was structured in ways that avoided Bumpy testifying directly or being identified publicly as a cooperating witness. This arrangement protected Bumpy's reputation in criminal circles while serving federal prosecution interests. The specific criminal enterprise at the center of the conflict, Harlem's numbers racket, represented significant economic activity. The numbers game was a form of illegal lottery where participants bet small amounts on three-digit numbers drawn daily. The game was popular in black communities because it required only small bets, was accessible to working-class bettors, and was seen as less exploitative than other forms of gambling controlled by white operators. Estimates suggest that the numbers racket in Harlem generated millions of dollars annually during the 1950s, supporting not just criminal operators, but also a network of runners, collectors, and clerks who earned legitimate income from the enterprise. Control of this operation meant access to substantial cash flows and influence over thousands of people whose economic survival depended on the system's continuation. When Genovese attempted to subordinate Bumpy, he was not just attacking an individual, but threatening an economic structure that employed substantial portions of Harlem's working-class population. The technical aspects of Bumpy's entry into Genovese's residence illustrate sophistication that would surprise those with stereotyped assumptions about criminal operations. Defeating locks without leaving traces of forced entry required specialized knowledge and equipment. Moving through an occupied building without being observed required understanding of security patterns and human behavior. Entering a room where someone was present without alerting them required exceptional physical control and awareness. These capabilities suggest either personal expertise or access to specialists with particular skills. Some accounts of Bumpy's career mention his relationships with former military personnel and intelligence operatives who brought professional tradecraft into criminal contexts. Whether these relationships existed or whether Bumpy possessed such skills personally cannot be verified definitively. But the operational success demonstrates capabilities well beyond casual criminal activity. The decision to demonstrate capability rather than use it reflects sophisticated strategic thinking that distinguished Bumpy's approach. Actually harming Genovese would have forced escalation to all-out war with predictable outcomes. Federal intervention, massive violence, likely destruction of Bumpy's organization, even if he survived personally. The demonstration of capability without using it created different dynamics. It proved that Bumpy could retaliate if forced to do so, making it rational for Genovese to negotiate. It avoided triggering the automatic responses that actual violence would have produced. It created uncertainty about Bumpy's other capabilities and resources, encouraging caution rather than aggression. This approach required confidence that the demonstration alone would suffice, which itself suggested strength. Only someone certain of their position would risk showing capability without using it. The aftermath for both principal figures followed trajectories shaped by this confrontation. Genovese's subsequent prosecution and imprisonment removed him from active control of his criminal organization, though he continued attempting to direct operations from prison until his death. Bumpy maintained his position in Harlem until his death from a heart attack in 1968, dying in a Harlem restaurant while having breakfast. His funeral drew thousands of mourners and was attended by both legitimate community leaders and criminal figures, reflecting the complex role he occupied in Harlem society. The eulogies described him as a community protector who ensured that outside forces did not completely exploit Harlem's residents, a narrative that conveniently ignored the harm his criminal operations imposed on those same communities. This dual legacy, both protector and exploiter, characterized many black criminal figures who operated in neighborhoods where mainstream economic opportunities were systematically denied. The broader narrative arc, from public disrespect to recognized authority, emerges clearly when examining the full sequence. Genovese's initial demands represented a form of public humiliation. He was treating Bumpy as subordinate help whose autonomy could be eliminated at will. The attempt to trap Bumpy represented escalation of this disrespect into mortal threat. Bumpy's quiet withdrawal appeared to confirm subordinate status, satisfying Genovese's need for public deference while secretly preparing response. The entry into Genovese's residence reversed the power dynamic completely, demonstrating that Bumpy possessed capabilities and resources Genovese had failed to anticipate. The subsequent negotiation occurred between figures who now recognized each other as serious threats, requiring accommodation rather than elimination. This transformation from disrespect to mutual recognition did not produce equality. Structural advantages of the Italian families persisted, but it established Bumpy's autonomy within his sphere of operation. The systemic implications extend beyond individual criminal careers into questions about how power actually functions in complex social structures. Official narratives about organized crime often present it as operating outside normal social rules, as pure violence and exploitation unconstrained by law or ethics. The reality was far more complex. Criminal enterprises existed within larger systems, political, economic, social, and their success depended on managing relationships with multiple parties. Law enforcement could be avoided through political protection, but needed to be placated when higher-level attention threatened. Legitimate community leaders needed to be accommodated because their opposition could generate pressure that criminal power alone could not resist. Federal authorities became dangerous when local protection proved insufficient. Internal discipline within criminal organizations depended on shared interests and mutual benefit, not just fear. Understanding these systemic constraints allowed Bumpy to identify leverage points where pressure could be applied effectively. The demonstration was not that violence could be threatened, but that the systems Genovese relied upon for protection and authority could be undermined by someone who understood how they actually functioned. The intelligence community that eventually formed around federal prosecution of organized crime drew substantially on information networks established during this period. The relationship between black operators in Harlem and federal prosecutors created channels that would prove useful in multiple subsequent investigations. The lawyers who facilitated these connections learned methods for managing information flows that protected sources while serving prosecution interests. The pattern of using legitimate professional relationships to obscure direct cooperation became a model for how federal authorities could develop cases against criminal organizations while protecting cooperating witnesses. These techniques would eventually contribute to prosecution strategies that, by the 1970s and 1980s, successfully dismantled much of the Italian organized crime structure in New York. The physical courage required for Bumpy's action deserves acknowledgement, even while recognizing the strategic calculation behind it. Entering the home of someone who had ordered multiple murders, who commanded an organization capable of killing anyone who threatened him, who had every reason to respond violently to such intrusion, required either exceptional confidence or willingness to die making a point. The fact that Bumpy believed demonstrating capability would produce negotiation rather than immediate lethal response suggests he understood Genovese's psychology and strategic thinking at a deep level. This understanding might have come from years of observing Genovese's behavior, from intelligence provided by others who knew him well, or from insight into how power actually works that allowed Bumpy to predict responses accurately. Whatever the source of his confidence, the gamble succeeded in changing power dynamics that had appeared fixed. The role of intermediaries and coalition members in enabling Bumpy's survival illustrates how power often functions through networks rather than individual capability. Bumpy himself possessed intelligence, strategic thinking, and physical courage, but his success depended substantially on lawyers who connected him to federal authorities, political figures who applied pressure through legitimate channels, other black operators who coordinated resistance, and Italian rivals who provided intelligence and support against common enemy. None of these parties acted purely from altruism. Each had their own interests in the outcome, but their collective action created constraints on Genovese that individual resistance could not have produced. This distributed power structure proved more resilient than hierarchical control because it could not be dismantled by eliminating any single individual. The documentation of this incident remains frustratingly incomplete for historians seeking definitive accounts. No newspaper reported on Bumpy entering Genovese's residence. Such incidents typically occurred without media coverage in 1950s organized crime. Police records from this period are incomplete and often deliberately vague about higher-level criminal operations that implicated corrupt officers. Federal files confirm basic patterns, but rarely document specific incidents that did not result in prosecution. Much of what is known comes from accounts that participants or knowledgeable observers provided years later after principals had died and legal risks had diminished. These later accounts vary in details and sometimes conflict in specifics while agreeing on basic patterns. This evidentiary situation is frustrating for historians, but reflects the nature of criminal enterprises that operated specifically to avoid creating documentary evidence of their activities. The ethical complexity of this narrative requires acknowledgement. The story presented here traces how someone operating completely outside legal constraints successfully navigated challenge from more powerful criminal figure. This is not morally neutral narrative. Both principal figures were deeply involved in enterprises that caused substantial harm to communities and individuals. The numbers racket that Bumpy controlled exploited poor people's hopes of escaping poverty through gambling wins that almost never occurred. The violence used to maintain control of criminal territories killed people and terrorized neighborhoods. The political corruption that provided protection undermined democratic governance and rule of law. The fact that Bumpy demonstrated sophistication and strategic intelligence does not make his activities admirable, and his victory preserved a criminal operation that continued exploiting Harlem residents. The narrative is worth examining because it illustrates how power functions, how subordinated groups navigate hostile systems, and how intelligence and organization can offset resource disadvantages. But these lessons should not be confused with moral endorsement of criminal activity. The incident's place in the larger history of Harlem during the 1950s reflects the community's complex position in New York's economic and social structure. Harlem had been center of black cultural and intellectual life during the Renaissance of the 1920s, but by the 1950s faced declining economic conditions as businesses relocated and employment opportunities diminished. The neighborhood remained vibrant culturally, while experiencing increasing poverty and marginalization. Criminal enterprises like the Numbers Racket provided economic activity in an environment where legitimate business investment was limited by racial discrimination and redlining. This context explains why community leaders might tacitly support criminal operators like Bumpy, who at least kept economic activity circulating within Harlem rather than being extracted to downtown white-controlled enterprises. The moral complexity of this position, supporting crime because it provided jobs and resources that legitimate economy denied, reflects the impossible choices that structural racism created for black communities. The evolution of organized crime prosecution from this period forward shows the lasting impact of cases built during the late 1950s. The Appalachian meeting exposed the national scope of Italian organized crime coordination and justified federal intervention that had previously been legally difficult. The cooperation of witnesses and information sources that emerged during this period established models for how federal prosecutors could build conspiracy cases against criminal leadership. The realization that criminal organizations depended on political protection that could be disrupted through publicity and federal oversight changed prosecution strategies. By the 1960s and 1970s, federal authorities were routinely pursuing conspiracy cases against organized crime figures using methods pioneered during the Appalachian aftermath. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970, provided additional legal tools that eventually dismantled much of traditional organized crime structure. These developments traced back to the moment when exposure of coordinated criminal organization created political will for aggressive federal prosecution. The story of Bumpy Johnson and Vito Genovese ultimately illustrates principles about power that transcend their specific criminal context. Power, based primarily on violence and intimidation, proves less stable than power built on multiple foundations, including political protection, economic benefit to multiple parties, and intelligence capabilities that allow anticipating threats. Subordinated groups can maintain autonomy when they develop sophisticated understanding of how power structures actually function and identify leverage points where pressure can be applied effectively. Coalition building across traditional boundaries often proves more effective than attempting to match superior force directly. Demonstrating capability creates different strategic dynamics than using capability, because it allows de-escalation while establishing deterrence. Patience and preparation matter more than immediate confrontation in situations where resource disadvantage makes direct conflict dangerous. The morning after Bumpy Johnson sat in Vito Genovese's living room, both men understood that their relationship had fundamentally changed. The surface arrangements might appear similar. Bumpy continued operating in Harlem. Genovese maintained his position among Italian families. Tribute continued flowing according to established percentages. But the underlying reality had shifted. Bumpy had demonstrated that he could not be eliminated without costs Genovese was unwilling to pay. He had exposed vulnerabilities in Genovese's security and authority that others would notice. He had established himself as someone who operated with sophistication that commanded respect rather than someone who could be muscled into complete subordination. This shift from disrespected subordinate to recognized power did not produce equality or eliminate structural advantages the Italian families maintained. But within the narrow space available to a black criminal operator in 1950s New York, it represented achievable victory, survival, autonomy, and the respect that comes from demonstrating capabilities others had failed to anticipate. The legacy of that demonstration would influence how power was negotiated in Harlem's criminal economy for the next decade, until changing federal prosecution strategies and internal conflicts within the Italian families transformed the entire structure of organized crime in New York.